One of the topics that we think is really interesting is what happens when CEOs take a very controversial but personal position on topics related to the environment or society or even political. And it gets a lot of attention, and customers and employees see this, and it can have some either positive or negative consequences on the company. We're finding it's about maybe 10% or even less of the CEOs who are engaging in activism in one form or another. So it's not like it's everybody doing it, but the ones that are doing it tend to be very well-known, very popular, sometimes founders, sometimes people that just have had a visionary impact on the corporation. The types of things we're interested in are activism by the CEO along things that reflect their personal view. We're not talking about positions that the CEO takes that you can imagine the position being taken as one that makes the company better off. Something like immigration visas for engineers. You can imagine companies that are tech companies, that's a really good thing. And it may be controversial, but it's really something that would help them as a company. So one thing that's interesting based on our surveys is there's certain topics that society seems to want people to weigh on and other topics not. So topics like healthcare, clean energy, the environment seem to be very, very popular. But things like abortion, religion, politics, things like that, they tend to want the CEOs to stay out of that. So something like, I think we all agree is really important to talk about is gun control. It's a super controversial area, especially depending on what part of the country you're from. And so, do you want to take a stance or potentially fund some initiative on gun control? Well, you're going to have a lot of employees and customers that'll find that to be a good thing, and others that would find that to be something you got to really stay out of. So CEOs are much more visible. There's a lot more eyes on them. And so when CEOs are activists, they take a very personal position on a controversial topic. It shows up almost immediately. The velocity of social media is such that you could go from nothing to something pretty serious in a matter of minutes or hours, and that can explode either in good ways or bad ways. If you take a position that most customers don't agree with, you could lose sales. Or if you take a position that's not consistent with what employees want, you could have a hard time attracting and retaining employees. One of the things we're doing now is taking a look at what happens to sales and purchases of companies, typically in the retail space, but where the CEO's taken a very strong position on a controversial topic. Did sales go up or down, things like that. If you take a stance on something, you can start doing some arithmetic where what customers might we lose or what customers might we gain by doing these things. Same thing on the employee side. There are some employees that would be turned off by this and maybe leave, and others would be attracted to it. The flip side of it is, and we've done some surveys, what you find is that about 2/3 of the people want the CEOs to take a leadership position in some of these controversial environmental and social issues. It varies a bit depending on your political affiliation or what generation you're in, whether you're a boomer or Gen Xer or millennial or whatever. But the costs and benefits are something you want to think about. It's hard to quantify, but it may be the case that companies are willing to maybe take a hit in terms of the economics, but actually do something really good for the environment or other stakeholders. One thing that we find in the research is some early indications that consumers are willing to buy more from companies that take an activist position on positions that they agree with. But we find the flip side as well, that they're likely to buy less from companies that take an activist position on something that they disagree with. So these positions can shift customer purchases, and ultimately it affects the bottom line of the company. The one thing I think is really key is that the board and the governance structure of the organization have to anticipate these things, and they want to talk about it ahead of time and not be blindsided. And I think the smart boards are actually kind of going through a bit of scenarios where what will we do if? I think the boards really need to think about, do they want the CEO, making personal statements about these things or not? And one pushback might be, well, it's the CEO saying it, it's his personal opinion or her personal opinion. But really it's hard to separate the CEO of the company as a person from the company itself. So that could either be a good thing or a bad thing. You want to put kind of constraints on them, kind of lay that out in a formal way. And then if you take these positions, you might want to think about what's the cost and benefits of doing that for shareholders. So it's complicated. So the role of the board is tricky, and it's evolving, especially now. Companies have historically been, in the US at least, focused on shareholder value. More recently, some of the big institutional investors like Larry Fink at BlackRock have sent letters out to boards saying, hey, you have to take these other stakeholders into account: customers, employees, the society, environment, and even the government. So, there's push to sort of change from a strict shareholder focus. In that kind of setting, you can imagine CEOs advocating certain positions that they view as better for society and kind of embrace the stakeholder views, where it's like, let's really start paying serious attention to the environment or workplace diversity or things like that. So I think it's going to be interesting to see how the board's focus changes, and I think it's going to be interesting to see how CEOs respond. But it's an evolution. You can imagine at some point people demanding, here are these topics that we feel strongly about as customers and employees. What is your stance, on this kind of thing? There's a lot of things that would probably make, the environment better off that are very costly, where, the value to shareholders is probably not positive. That's where it becomes very, very complicated. You're willing to make those investments because it's just the right thing to do for those stakeholders. And I think that whole thing has to be mapped out. There's certainly a lot more discussion about stakeholder interests now, people investing in environmental, social, and governance sorts of funds, more money pouring into that, that type of thing. You're going to have a whole new generation of board members that sort of understand this stuff, grew up with it. And I think it is going to change the discussion. It'll be interesting to see how that plays out going forward.